Welcome to Major Antonio's presentation of My Disillusionment in Russia by Emma Goldman. Preface.
The decision to record my experiences, observations, and reactions during my stay in Russia I had made long before I thought of leaving that country. In fact, that was my main reason for departing from that tragically heroic land. The strongest of us are loath to give up a long-cherished dream. I had come to Russia possessed by the hope that I should find a newborn country, with its people wholly consecrated to the great, though very difficult, task of revolutionary reconstruction. And I had fervently hoped that I might become an active part of the inspiring work. I found reality in Russia grotesque, totally unlike the great ideal that had borne me upon the crest of high hope to the land of promise. It required 15 long months before I could get my bearings. Each day, each week, each month added new links to the fatal chain that pulled down my cherished edifice. I fought desperately against the disillusionment. For a long time, I strove against the still voice within me which urged me to face the overpowering facts. I would not and could not give up. Then came Kronstadt. It was the final wrench. It completed the terrible realization that the Russian Revolution was no more. I saw before me the Bolshevik state, formidable, crushing every constructive revolutionary effort, suppressing, debasing, and disintegrating everything. Unable and unwilling to become a cog in that sinister machine, and aware that I could be of no practical use to Russia and her people, I decided to leave the country. Once out of it, I would relate honestly, frankly, and as objectively as humanly possible to me the story of my 2 years' stay in Russia. I left in December 1921. I could have written then, fresh under the influence of the ghastly experience. But I waited 4 months before I could bring myself to write a series of articles. I delayed another 4 months before beginning the present volume. I do not pretend to write a history. Removed by 50 or 100 years from the events he is describing, the historian may seem to be objective. But real history is not a compilation of mere data. It is valueless without the human element which the historian necessarily gets from the writings of the contemporaries of the events in question. It is the personal reactions of the participants and observers which lend vitality to all history and make it vivid and alive. Thus, numerous histories have been written of the French Revolution, yet there are only a very few that stand out true and convincing, illuminative, in the degree in which the historian has felt his subject through the medium of human documents left by the contemporaries of the period. I myself, and I believe most students of history, have felt and visualized the great French Revolution much more vitally from the letters and diaries of contemporaries, such as Madame Roland, Mirabeau, and other eyewitnesses, than from the so-called objective historians. By a strange coincidence, a volume of letters written during the French Revolution and compiled by the able German anarchist publicist Gustav Landauer, came into my hands during the most critical period of my Russian experience. I was actually reading them while hearing the Bolshevik artillery begin the bombardment of the Kronstadt rebels. Those letters gave me a most vivid insight into the events of the French Revolution. As never before, they brought home to me the realization that the Bolshevik regime in Russia was, on the whole, a significant replica of what had happened in France more than a century before. Great interpreters of the French Revolution, like Thomas Carlyle and Peter Kropotkin, drew their understanding and inspiration from the human records of the period. Similarly, will the future historians of the Great Russian Revolution, if they are to write real history and not a mere compilation of facts, draw from the impressions and reactions of those who have lived through the Russian Revolution, who have shared the misery and travail of the people, and who actually participated in or witnessed the tragic panorama in its daily unfoldment. While in Russia, I had no clear idea how much had already been written on the subject of the Russian Revolution. But the few books which reached me occasionally impressed me as most inadequate. They were written by people with no first-hand knowledge of the situation and were sadly superficial. Some of the writers had spent from 2 weeks to 2 months in Russia, did not know the language of the country, and in most instances were chaperoned by official guides and interpreters. I do not refer here to the writers who, in and out of Russia, play the role of Bolshevik court functionaries. They are a class apart. With them, I deal in the chapter on the traveling salesmen of the Revolution. Here I have in mind the sincere friends of the Russian Revolution. The work of most of them has resulted in incalculable confusion and mischief. They have helped to perpetuate the myth that the Bolsheviki and the Revolution are synonymous. Yet nothing is further from the truth. The actual Russian Revolution took place in the summer months of 1917. During that period, the peasants possessed themselves of the land, the workers of the factories, thus demonstrating that they knew well the meaning of social revolution. The October change was the finishing touch to the work begun 6 months previously. In the Great Uprising, the Bolsheviki assumed the voice of the people. They clothed themselves with the agrarian program of the social revolutionists and the industrial tactics of the anarchists. But after the high tide of revolutionary enthusiasm had carried them into power, the Bolsheviki discarded their false plumes. It was then that began the spiritual separation between the Bolsheviki and the Russian Revolution. With each succeeding day, the gap grew wider, their interests more conflicting. Today, it is no exaggeration to state that the Bolsheviki stand as the arch enemies of the Russian Revolution. Superstitions die hard. In the case of this modern superstition, the process is doubly hard, because various factors have combined to administer artificial respiration. International intervention, the blockade, and the very efficient world propaganda of the Communist Party have kept the Bolshevik myth alive. Even the terrible famine is being exploited to that end. How powerful a hold that superstition wields, I realize from my own experience. I had always known that the Bolsheviki are Marxists. For 30 years, I fought the Marxian theory as a cold, mechanistic, enslaving formula. In pamphlets, lectures, and debates, I argued against it. I was therefore not unaware of what might be expected from the Bolsheviki. But the Allied attack upon them made them the symbol of the Russian Revolution and brought me to their defense. From November 1917 until February 1918, while out on bail for my attitude against the war, I toured America in defense of the Bolsheviki. I published a pamphlet in elucidation of the Russian Revolution and in justification of the Bolsheviki. I defended them as embodying in practice the spirit of the revolution, in spite of their theoretic Marxism. My attitude toward them at that time is characterized in the following passages from my pamphlet. The truth about the Bolsheviki, quote, "The Russian Revolution is a miracle in more than one respect. Among other extraordinary paradoxes, it presents the phenomenon of the Marxian social democrats, Lenin and Trotsky, adopting anarchist revolutionary tactics, while the anarchists Kropotkin, Cherkessov, Tchaikovsky are denying these tactics and falling into Marxian reasoning, which they had all their lives repudiated as German metaphysics. The Bolsheviki of 1903, though revolutionists, adhered to the Marxian doctrine concerning the industrialization of Russia and the historic mission of the bourgeoisie as a necessary evolutionary process before the Russian masses could come into their own. The Bolsheviki of 1917 no longer believe in the predestined function of the bourgeoisie. They have been swept forward on the waves of the revolution to the point of view held by the anarchists since Bakunin, namely, that once the masses become conscious of their economic power, they make their own history and need not be bound by traditions and processes of a dead past, which, like secret treaties, are made at a round table and are not dictated by life itself." Unquote. In 1918, Madame Breshkovsky visited the United States and began her campaign against the Bolsheviki. I was then in the Missouri Penitentiary. Grieved and shocked by the work of the little grandmother of the Russian Revolution, I wrote imploring her to bethink herself and not betray the cause she had given her life to. On that occasion, I emphasized the fact that while neither of us agreed with the Bolsheviki in theory, we should yet be one with them in defending the revolution. When the courts of the state of New York upheld the fraudulent methods by which I was disfranchised and my American citizenship of 32 years denied me, I waived my right of appeal in order that I might return to Russia and help in the great work. I believed fervently that the Bolsheviki were furthering the revolution and exerting themselves in behalf of the people. I clung to my faith and belief for more than a year after my coming to Russia. Observation and study, extensive travel through various parts of the country, meeting with every shade of political opinion and every variety of friend and enemy of the Bolsheviki, all convinced me of the ghastly delusion which had been foisted upon the world. I refer to these circumstances to indicate that my change of mind and heart was a painful and difficult process, and that my final decision to speak out is for the sole reason that the people everywhere may learn to differentiate between the Bolsheviki and the Russian Revolution. The conventional conception of gratitude is that one must not be critical of those who have shown him kindness. Thanks to this notion, parents enslave their children more effectively than by brutal treatment, and by it, friends tyrannize over one another. In fact, all human relationships are today vitiated by this noxious idea. Some people have upbraided me for my critical attitude toward the Bolsheviki. How ungrateful to attack the communist government after the hospitality and kindness she enjoyed in Russia, they indignantly exclaim. I do not mean to gainsay that I have received advantages while I was in Russia. I could have received many more had I been willing to serve the powers that be. It is that very circumstance which has made it bitter hard for me to speak out against the evils as I saw them day by day. But finally I realized that silence is indeed a sign of consent. Not to cry out against the betrayal of the Russian Revolution would have made me a party to that betrayal. The revolution and the welfare of the masses in and out of Russia are by far too important to me to allow any personal consideration for the communists I have met and learned to respect, to obscure my sense of justice, and to cause me to refrain from giving to the world my 2 years' experience in Russia. In certain quarters, objections will no doubt be raised because I have given no names of the persons I am quoting. Some may even exploit the fact to discredit my veracity. But I prefer to face that, rather than to turn anyone over to the tender mercies of the Cheka, which would inevitably result were I to divulge the names of the communists or non-communists who felt free to speak to me. Those familiar with the real situation in Russia and who are not under the mesmeric influence of the Bolshevik superstition or in the employ of the communists will bear me out that I have given a true picture. The rest of the world will learn in due time. Friends whose opinion I value have been good enough to suggest that my quarrel with the Bolsheviki is due to my social philosophy rather than to the failure of the Bolshevik regime. As an anarchist, they claim, I would naturally insist on the importance of the individual and of personal liberty, but in the revolutionary period, both must be subordinated to the good of the whole. Other friends point out that destruction, violence, and terrorism are inevitable factors in a revolution. As a revolutionist, they say, I cannot consistently object to the violence practiced by the Bolsheviki. Both these criticisms would be justified had I come to Russia expecting to find anarchism realized, or if I were to maintain that revolutions can be made peacefully. Anarchism to me never was a mechanistic arrangement of social relationships to be imposed upon man by political scene shifting or by a transfer of power from one social class to another. Anarchism to me was and is the child, not of destruction, but of construction, the result of growth and development of the conscious creative social efforts of a regenerated people. I do not therefore expect anarchism to follow in the immediate footsteps of centuries of despotism and submission, and I certainly did not expect to see it ushered in by the Marxian theory. I did, however, hope to find in Russia at least the beginnings of the social changes for which the revolution had been fought. Not the fate of the individual was my main concern as a revolutionist. I should have been content if the Russian workers and peasants as a whole had derived essential social betterment as a result of the Bolshevik regime. 2 years of earnest study, investigation, and research convinced me that the great benefits brought to the Russian people by Bolshevism exist only on paper, painted in glowing colors to the masses of Europe and America by efficient Bolshevik propaganda. As advertising wizards, the Bolsheviki excel anything the world had ever known before. But in reality, the Russian people have gained nothing from the Bolshevik experiment. To be sure, the peasants have the land, not by the grace of the Bolsheviki, but through their own direct efforts, set in motion long before the October change. That the peasants were able to retain the land is due mostly to the static Slav tenacity, owing to the circumstance that they form by far the largest part of the population and are deeply rooted in the soil. They could not as easily be torn away from it as the workers from their means of production. The Russian workers, like the peasants, also employed direct action. They possessed themselves of the factories, organized their own shop committees, and were virtually in control of the economic life of Russia. But soon they were stripped of their power and placed under the industrial yoke of the Bolshevik state. Chattel slavery became the lot of the Russian proletariat. It was suppressed and exploited in the name of something which was later to bring it comfort, light, and warmth. Try as I might, I could find nowhere any evidence of benefits received either by the workers or the peasants from the Bolshevik regime. On the other hand, I did find the revolutionary faith of the people broken, the spirit of solidarity crushed, the meaning of comradeship and mutual helpfulness distorted. One must have lived in Russia, close to the everyday affairs of the people. One must have seen and felt their utter disillusionment and despair to appreciate fully the disintegrating effect of the Bolshevik principle and methods, disintegrating all that was once the pride and the glory of revolutionary Russia. The argument that destruction and terror are part of revolution, I do not dispute. I know that in the past every great political and social change necessitated violence. America might still be under the British yoke, but for the heroic colonists who dared to oppose British tyranny by force of arms. Black slavery might still be a legalized institution in the United States, but for the militant spirit of the John Browns. I have never denied that violence is inevitable, nor do I gainsay it now. Yet it is one thing to employ violence in combat as a means of defense. It is quite another thing to make a principle of terrorism, to institutionalize it, to assign it the most vital place in the social struggle. Such terrorism begets counter-revolution, and in turn itself becomes counter-revolutionary. Rarely has a revolution been fought with as little violence as the Russian Revolution. Nor would have Red Terror followed had the people and the cultural forces remained in control of the revolution. This was demonstrated by the spirit of fellowship and solidarity which prevailed throughout Russia during the first months after the October Revolution. But an insignificant minority bent on creating an absolute state is necessarily driven to oppression and terrorism. There is another objection to my criticism on the part of the communists. Russia is on strike, they say, and it is unethical for a revolutionist to side against the workers when they are striking against their masters. That is pure demagoguery practiced by the Bolsheviki to silence criticism. It is not true that the Russian people are on strike. On the contrary, the truth of the matter is that the Russian people have been locked out and that the Bolshevik state, even as the bourgeois industrial master, uses the sword and the gun to keep the people out. In the case of the Bolsheviki, this tyranny is masked by a world-stirring slogan. Thus they have succeeded in blinding the masses. Just because I am a revolutionist, I refuse to side with the master class, which in Russia is called the Communist Party. Till the end of my days, my place shall be with the disinherited and oppressed. It is immaterial to me whether tyranny rules in the Kremlin or in any other seat of the mighty. I could do nothing for suffering Russia while in that country. Perhaps I can do something now by pointing out the lessons of the Russian experience. Not my concern for the Russian people only has prompted the writing of this volume. It is my interest in the masses everywhere. The masses, like the individual, may not readily learn from the experience of others, yet those who have gained the experience must speak out, if for no other reason than that they cannot injustice to themselves and their ideal support the great delusion revealed to them. Emma Goldman, Berlin, July, 1922.
Chapter 1. Deportation to Russia.
On the night of December 21, 1919, together with 248 other political prisoners, I was deported from America. Although it was generally known we were to be deported, few really believed that the United States would so completely deny her past as an asylum for political refugees, some of whom had lived and worked in America for more than 30 years. In my own case, the decision to eliminate me first became known when, in 1909, the federal authorities went out of their way to disfranchise the man whose name gave me citizenship. That Washington waited till 1917 was due to the circumstance that the psychologic moment for the finale was lacking. Perhaps I should have contested my case at that time. With the then prevalent public opinion, the courts would probably not have sustained the fraudulent proceedings which robbed me of citizenship. But it did not seem credible then that America would stoop to the Tsaristic method of deportation. Our anti-war agitation added fuel to the war hysteria of 1917, and thus furnished the federal authorities with the desired opportunity to complete the conspiracy begun against me in Rochester, New York, 1909. It was on December 5, 1919, while in Chicago lecturing, that I was telegraphically apprised of the fact that the order for my deportation was final. The question of my citizenship was then raised in court, but was of course decided adversely. I had intended to take the case to a higher tribunal, but finally I decided to carry the matter no further. Soviet Russia was luring me. Ludicrously secretive were the authorities about our deportation. To the very last moment we were kept in ignorance as to the time. Then, unexpectedly, in the wee small hours of December 21st, we were spirited away. The scene set for this performance was most thrilling. It was 6 o'clock Sunday morning, December 21st, 1919, when under heavy military convoy we stepped aboard the Buford. For 28 days we were prisoners. Sentries at our cabin doors day and night, sentries on deck during the hour we were daily permitted to breathe the fresh air. Our men comrades were cooped up in dark, damp quarters, wretchedly fed, all of us in complete ignorance of the direction we were to take. Yet our spirits were high. Russia, free, new Russia was before us. All my life, Russia's heroic struggle for freedom was as a beacon to me. The revolutionary zeal of her martyred men and women, which neither fortress nor katorga could suppress, was my inspiration in the darkest hours. When the news of the February Revolution flashed across the world, I longed to hasten to the land which had performed the miracle and had freed her people from the age-old yoke of Tsarism. But America held me. The thought of 30 years of struggle for my ideals, of my friends and associates, made it impossible to tear myself away. I would go to Russia later, I thought. Then came America's entry into the war and the need of remaining true to the American people who were swept into the hurricane against their will. After all, I owed a great debt. I owed my growth and development to what was finest and best in America, to her fighters for liberty, to the sons and daughters of the revolution to come. I would be true to them. But the frenzied militarists soon terminated my work. At last I was bound for Russia, and all else was almost blotted out. I would behold with mine own eyes Matushka Rossiya, the land freed from political and economic masters, the Russian Dubanushka, as the peasant was called, raised from the dust, the Russian worker, the modern Samson, who with a sweep of his mighty arm had pulled down the pillars of decaying society. The 28 days on our floating prison passed in a sort of trance. I was hardly conscious of my surroundings. Finally, we reached Finland, across which we were forced to journey in sealed cars. On the Russian border, we were met by a committee of the Soviet government, headed by Zorin. They had come to greet the first political refugees driven from America for opinion's sake. It was a cold day, with the earth a sheet of white, but spring was in our hearts. Soon we were to behold revolutionary Russia. I preferred to be alone when I touched the sacred soil. My exaltation was too great, and I feared I might not be able to control my emotion. When I reached Beloestrov, the first enthusiastic reception tendered the refugees was over, but the place was still surcharged with intensity of feeling. I could sense the awe and humility of our group, who, treated like felons in the United States, were here received as dear brothers and comrades and welcomed by the Red Soldiers, the liberators of Russia. From Beloestrov we were driven to the village where another reception had been prepared. A dark hall filled to suffocation, the platform lit up by tallow candles, a huge red flag, on the stage a group of women in black nuns' attire. I stood as in a dream in the breathless silence. Suddenly a voice rang out. It beat like metal on my ears and seemed uninspired. but it spoke of the great suffering of the Russian people and of the enemies of the revolution. Others addressed the audience, but I was held by the women in black, their faces ghastly in the yellow light. Were these really nuns? Had the revolution penetrated even the walls of superstition? Had the Red Dawn broken into the narrow lives of these ascetics? It all seemed strange, fascinating. Somehow, I found myself on the platform. I could only blurt out that, like my comrades, I had not come to Russia to teach. I had come to learn, to draw sustenance and hope from her, to lay down my life on the altar of the revolution. After the meeting, we were escorted to the waiting Petrograd train, the women in the black hood intoning the Internationale, the whole audience joining in. I was in the car with our host, Zoran, who had lived in America and spoke English fluently. He talked enthusiastically about the Soviet government and its marvelous achievements. His conversation was illuminative, but one phrase struck me as discordant. Speaking of the political organization of his party, he remarked, "Tammany Hall has nothing on us, and as to Boss Murphy, we could teach him a thing or two." I thought the man was jesting. What relation could there be between Tammany Hall, Boss Murphy, and the Soviet government? I inquired about our comrades who had hastened from America at the first news of the revolution. Many of them had died at the front, Zoran informed me. Others were working with the Soviet government. And Shadoff, William Shadoff, a brilliant speaker and able organizer, was a well-known figure in America, frequently associated with us in our work. We had sent him a telegram from Finland and were much surprised at his failure to reply. Why did not Shadoff come to meet us? Shadoff had to leave for Siberia, where he is to take the post of Minister of Railways, said Zoran. In Petrograd, our group again received an ovation. Then the deportees were taken to the famous Tauride Palace, where they were to be fed and housed for the night. Zoran asked Alexander Berkman and myself to accept his hospitality. We entered the waiting automobile. The city was dark and deserted, not a living soul to be seen anywhere. We had not gone very far when the car was suddenly halted and an electric light flashed into our eyes. It was the militia demanding the password. Petrograd had recently fought back the Yudenich attack and was still under martial law. The process was repeated frequently along the route. Shortly before we reached our destination, we passed a well-lighted building. "It is our station house," Zoran explained, "but we have few prisoners there now. Capital punishment is abolished, and we have recently proclaimed a general political amnesty." Presently, the automobile came to a halt. "The first house of the Soviets," said Zoran, "the living place of the most active members of our party." Zoran and his wife occupied 2 rooms, simply but comfortably furnished. Tea and refreshments were served, and our hosts entertained us with the absorbing story of the marvelous defense the Petrograd workers had organized against the Yudenich forces. How heroically the men and women, even the children, had rushed to the defense of the Red City. What wonderful self-discipline and cooperation the proletariat demonstrated. The evening passed in these reminiscences, and I was about to retire to the room secured for me when a young woman arrived who introduced herself as the sister-in-law of Bill Shadoff. She greeted us warmly and asked us to come up to see her sister who lived on the floor above. When we reached their apartment, I found myself embraced by big, jovial Bill himself. How strange of Zoran to tell me that Shadoff had left for Siberia. What did it mean? Shadoff explained that he had been ordered not to meet us at the border to prevent his giving us our first impressions of Soviet Russia. He had fallen into disfavor with the government and was being sent to Siberia into virtual exile. His trip had been delayed, and therefore we still happened to find him. We spent much time with Shadoff before he left Petrograd. For whole days I listened to his story of the revolution, with its light and shadows, and the developing tendency of the Bolsheviki toward the right. Shadoff, however, insisted that it was necessary for all the revolutionary elements to work with the Bolsheviki government. Of course, the communists had made many mistakes, but what they did was inevitable, imposed upon them by Allied interference and the blockade. A few days after our arrival, Zoran asked Alexander Berkman and myself to accompany him to Smolny. Smolny, the erstwhile boarding school for the daughters of the aristocracy, had been the center of revolutionary events. Almost every stone had played its part. Now it was the seat of the Petrograd government. I found the place heavily guarded and giving the impression of a beehive of officials and government employees. The department of the Third International was particularly interesting. It was the domain of Zinoviev. I was much impressed by the magnitude of it all. After showing us about, Zoran invited us to the Smolny dining room. The meal consisted of good soup, meat and potatoes, bread and tea. Rather a good meal in starving Russia, I thought. Our group of deportees was quartered in Smolny. I was anxious about my traveling companions, the two girls who had shared my cabin on the Buford. I wished to take them back with me to the first house of the Soviet. Zoran sent for them. They arrived greatly excited and told us that the whole group of deportees had been placed under military guard. The news was startling. The people who had been driven out of America for their political opinions, now, in revolutionary Russia, again prisoners 3 days after their arrival. What had happened? We turned to Zoran. He seemed embarrassed. Some mistake, he said, and immediately began to make inquiries. It developed that 4 ordinary criminals had been found among the politicals deported by the United States government, and therefore a guard was placed over the whole group. The proceeding seemed to me unjust and uncalled for. It was my first lesson in Bolshevik methods.
Chapter 2, Petrograd.
My parents had moved to St. Petersburg when I was 13. Under the discipline of a German school in Königsberg and the Prussian attitude toward everything Russian, I had grown up in the atmosphere of hatred to that country. I dreaded especially the terrible nihilists who had killed Tsar Alexander II, so good and kind, as I had been taught. St. Petersburg was to me an evil thing. But the gaiety of the city, its vivacity and brilliancy, soon dispelled my childish fancies and made the city appear like a fairy dream. Then my curiosity was aroused by the revolutionary mystery which seemed to hang over everyone and of which no one dared to speak. When 4 years later I left with my sister for America, I was no longer the German Gretchen to whom Russia spelt evil. My whole soul had been transformed and the seed planted for what was to be my life's work. Especially did St. Petersburg remain in my memory, a vivid picture, full of life and mystery. I found Petrograd of 1920 quite a different place. It was almost in ruins, as if a hurricane had swept over it. The houses looked like broken old tombs upon neglected and forgotten cemeteries. The streets were dirty and deserted. All life had gone from them. The population of Petrograd before the war was almost 2 million. In 1920, it had dwindled to 500,000. The people walked about like living corpses. The shortage of food and fuel was slowly sapping the city. Grim death was clutching at its heart. Emaciated and frostbitten men, women, and children were being whipped by the common lash, the search for a piece of bread or a stick of wood. It was a heart-rending sight by day, an oppressive wait at night. Especially were the nights of the first month in Petrograd dreadful. The utter stillness of the large city was paralyzing. It fairly haunted me, this awful oppressive silence broken only by occasional shots. I would lay awake trying to pierce the mystery. Did not Zoran say that capital punishment had been abolished? Why this shooting? Doubts disturbed my mind, but I tried to wave them aside. I had come to learn. Much of my first knowledge and impressions of the October Revolution and the events that followed, I received from the Zorans. As already mentioned, both had lived in America, spoke English, and were eager to enlighten me upon the history of the Revolution. They were devoted to the cause and worked very hard, he especially, who was secretary of the Petrograd committee of his party, besides editing the daily Krasnaya Gazeta and participating in other activities. It was from Zoran that I first learned about that legendary figure, Makhno. The latter was an anarchist, I was informed, who under the Tsar had been sentenced to katorga. Liberated by the February Revolution, he became the leader of a peasant army in the Ukraine, proving himself extremely able and daring and doing splendid work in the defense of the revolution. For some time, Makhno worked in harmony with the Bolsheviki, fighting the counter-revolutionary forces. Then he became antagonistic, and now his army, recruited from bandit elements, was fighting the Bolsheviki. Zoran related that he had been one of a committee sent to Makhno to bring about an understanding. But Makhno would not listen to reason. He continued his warfare against the Soviets and was considered a dangerous counter-revolutionist. I had no means of verifying the story, and I was far from disbelieving the Zorans. Both appeared most sincere and dedicated to their work, types of religious zealots ready to burn the heretic, but equally ready to sacrifice their own lives for their cause. I was much impressed by the simplicity of their lives. Holding a responsible position, Zoran could have received special rations, but they lived very poorly, their supper often consisting only of herring, black bread, and tea. I thought it especially admirable because Lisa Zoran was with child at the time. 2 weeks after my arrival in Russia, I was invited to attend the Alexander Herzen commemoration in the Winter Palace. The white marble hall where the gathering took place seemed to intensify the bitter frost, but the people present were unmindful of the penetrating cold. I also was conscious only of the unique situation. Alexander Herzen, one of the most hated revolutionists of his time, honored in the Winter Palace. Frequently before the spirit of Herzen had found its way into the house of the Romanovs. It was when the Kolokol, published abroad and sparkling with the brilliancy of Herzen and Turgenev, would in some mysterious manner be discovered on the desk of the Tsar. Now the Tsars were no more, but the spirit of Herzen had risen again and was witnessing the realization of the dream of one of Russia's great men. One evening, I was informed that Zinoviev had returned from Moscow and would see me. He arrived about midnight. He looked very tired and was constantly disturbed by urgent messages. Our talk was of a general nature, of the grave situation in Russia, the shortage of food and fuel, then particularly poignant, and about the labor situation in America. He was anxious to know how soon the revolution could be expected in the United States. He left upon me no definite impression, but I was conscious of something lacking in the man, though I could not determine at the time just what it was. Another communist I saw much of the first weeks was John Reed. I had known him in America. He was living in the Astoria, working hard and preparing for his return to the United States. He was to journey through Latvia, and he seemed apprehensive of the outcome. He had been in Russia during the October days, and this was his second visit. Like Shatov, he also insisted that the dark sides of the Bolshevik regime were inevitable. He believed fervently that the Soviet government would emerge from its narrow party lines and that it would presently establish the communistic Commonwealth. We spent much time together, discussing the various phases of the situation. So far, I had met none of the anarchists, and their failure to call rather surprised me. One day, a friend I had known in the States came to inquire whether I would see several members of an anarchist organization. I readily assented. From them, I learned a version of the Russian Revolution and the Bolshevik regime utterly different from what I had heard before. It was so startling, so terrible that I could not believe it. They invited me to attend a small gathering they had called to present to me their views. The following Sunday, I went to their conference. Passing Nevsky Prospect, near Latini Street, I came upon a group of women huddled together to protect themselves from the cold. They were surrounded by soldiers, talking and gesticulating. Those women, I learned, were prostitutes who were selling themselves for a pound of bread, a piece of soap, or chocolate. The soldiers were the only ones who could afford to buy them because of their extra rations. Prostitution in revolutionary Russia. I wondered, what is the communist government doing for these unfortunates? What are the workers and peasant Soviets doing? My escort smiled sadly. The Soviet government had closed the houses of prostitution and was now trying to drive the women off the streets. But hunger and cold drove them back again. Besides, the soldiers had to be humored. It was too ghastly, too incredible to be real, yet there they were, those shivering creatures for sale and their buyers, the red defenders of the revolution. The cursed interventionists, the blockade, they are responsible, said my escort. Why, yes, the counter-revolutionists and the blockade are responsible, I reassured myself. I tried to dismiss the thought of that huddled group, but it clung to me. I felt something snap within me. At last we reached the anarchist quarters, in a dilapidated house in a filthy backyard. I was ushered into a small room crowded with men and women. The sight recalled pictures of 30 years ago when, persecuted and hunted from place to place, the anarchists in America were compelled to meet in a dingy hall on Orchard Street, New York, or in the dark rear room of a saloon. That was in capitalistic America. But this is revolutionary Russia, which the anarchists had helped to free. Why should they have to gather in secret and in such a place? That evening and the following day, I listened to a recital of the betrayal of the revolution by the Bolsheviki. Workers from the Baltic factories spoke of their enslavement. Kronstadt sailors voiced their bitterness and indignation against the people they had helped to power and who had become their masters. One of the speakers had been condemned to death by the Bolsheviki for his anarchist ideas, but had escaped and was now living illegally. He related how the sailors had been robbed of the freedom of their Soviets, how every breath of life was being censored. Others spoke of the Red Terror and repression in Moscow, which resulted in the throwing of a bomb into the gathering of the Moscow section of the Communist Party in September 1919. They told me of the overfilled prisons, of the violence practiced on the workers and peasants. I listened rather impatiently, for everything in me cried out against this indictment. It sounded impossible. It could not be. Someone was surely at fault, but probably it was they, my comrades, I thought. They were unreasonable, impatient for immediate results. Was not violence inevitable in a revolution, and was it not imposed upon the Bolsheviki by the interventionists? My comrades were indignant. Disguise yourself so the Bolsheviki do not recognize you. Take a pamphlet of Kropotkin and try to distribute it in a Soviet meeting. You will soon see whether we told you the truth. Above all, get out of the first house of the Soviet. Live among the people, and you will have all the proofs you need. How childish and trifling it all seemed in the face of the world event that was taking place in Russia. No, I could not credit their stories. I would wait and study conditions, but my mind was in a turmoil, and the nights became more oppressive than ever. The day arrived when I was given a chance to attend the meeting of the Petro-Soviet. It was to be a double celebration in honor of the return of Karl Radek to Russia and Joffa's report on the peace treaty with Estonia. As usual, I went with the Zorins. The gathering was in the Tauride Palace, the former meeting place of the Russian Duma. Every entrance to the hall was guarded by soldiers, the platform surrounded by them holding their guns at attention. The hall was crowded to the very doors. I was on the platform overlooking the sea of faces below. Starved and wretched they looked, these sons and daughters of the people, the heroes of Red Petrograd, how they had suffered and endured for the revolution. I felt very humble before them. Zinoviev presided. After the Internationale had been sung by the audience standing, Zinoviev opened the meeting. He spoke at length. His voice is high-pitched, without depth. The moment I heard him, I realized what I had missed in him at our first meeting: depth, strength of character. Next came Radek. He was clever, witty, sarcastic, and he paid his respects to the counter-revolutionists and to the White Guards. Altogether, an interesting man and an interesting address. Joffa looked the diplomat. Well-fed and groomed, he seemed rather out of place in that assembly. He spoke of the peace conditions with Estonia, which were received with enthusiasm by the audience. Certainly these people wanted peace. Would it ever come to Russia? Last spoke Zorin, by far the ablest and most convincing that evening. Then the meeting was thrown open to discussion. A Menshevik asked for the floor. Immediately pandemonium broke loose. Yells of "Traitor! Kolchak! Counter-revolutionist" came from all parts of the audience and even from the platform. It looked to me like an unworthy proceeding for a revolutionary assembly. On the way home, I spoke to Zorin about it. He laughed. "Free speech is a bourgeois superstition," he said. "During a revolutionary period, there can be no free speech." I was rather dubious about the sweeping statement, but I felt that I had no right to judge. I was a newcomer, while the people at the Tauride Palace had sacrificed and suffered so much for the revolution. I had no right to judge.
Chapter 3: Disturbing Thoughts.
Life went on. Each day brought new conflicting thoughts and emotions. The feature which affected me most was the inequality I witnessed in my immediate environment. I learned that the rations issued to the tenants of the first house of the Soviet, Astoria, were much superior to those received by the workers in the factories. To be sure, they were not sufficient to sustain life, but no one in the Astoria lived from these rations alone. The members of the Communist Party, quartered in the Astoria, worked in Smolny, and the rations in Smolny were the best in Petrograd. Moreover, trade was not entirely suppressed at that time. The markets were doing a lucrative business, though no one seemed able or willing to explain to me where the purchasing capacity came from. The workers could not afford to buy butter, which was then 2,000 rubles a pound, sugar at 3,000, or meat at 1,000. The inequality was most apparent in the Astoria kitchen. I went there frequently, though it was torture to prepare a meal. The savage scramble for an inch of space on the stove, the greedy watching of the women lest anyone have something extra in the saucepan, the quarrels and screams when someone fished out a piece of meat from the pot of a neighbor. But there was one redeeming feature in the picture. It was the resentment of the servants who worked in the Astoria. They were servants, though called comrades, and they felt keenly the inequality. The revolution, to them, was not a mere theory to be realized in years to come. It was a living thing. I was made aware of it one day. The rations were distributed at the commissary, but one had to fetch them himself. One day, while waiting my turn in the long line, a peasant girl came in and asked for vinegar. "Vinegar, who is it calls for such a luxury?" cried several women. It appeared that the girl was Zinoviev's servant. She spoke of him as her master, who worked very hard and was surely entitled to something extra. At once a storm of indignation broke loose. "Master, is that what we made the revolution for? Or was it to do away with masters? Zinoviev is no more than we, and he is not entitled to more." These working women were crude, even brutal, but their sense of justice was instinctive. The revolution to them was something fundamentally vital. They saw the inequality at every step and bitterly resented it. I was disturbed. I sought to reassure myself that Zinoviev and the other leaders of the communists would not use their power for selfish benefit. It was the shortage of food and the lack of efficient organization which made it impossible to feed all alike. And of course the blockade and not the Bolsheviki was responsible for it. The Allied interventionists, who were trying to get at Russia's throat, were the cause. Every communist I met reiterated this thought. Even some of the anarchists insisted on it. The little group antagonistic to the Soviet government was not convincing. But how to reconcile the explanation given to me with some of the stories I learned every day, stories of systematic terrorism, of relentless persecution, and suppression of other revolutionary elements? Another circumstance which perplexed me was that the markets were stacked with meat, fish, soap, potatoes, even shoes, every time that the rations were given out. How did these things get to the markets? Everyone spoke about it, but no one seemed to know. One day I was in a watchmaker's shop when a soldier entered. He conversed with the proprietor in Yiddish, relating that he had just returned from Siberia with a shipment of tea. Would the watchmaker take 50 pounds? Tea was sold at a premium at the time. No one but the privileged few could permit themselves such a luxury. Of course, the watchmaker would take the tea. When the soldier left, I asked the shopkeeper if he did not think it rather risky to transact such illegal business so openly. I happen to understand Yiddish, I told him. Did he not fear I would report him? "That's nothing," the man replied nonchalantly. "The Cheka knows all about it. It draws its percentage from the soldier and myself." I began to suspect that the reason for much of the evil was also within Russia, not only outside of it. But then, I argued, police officials and detectives graft everywhere. That is the common disease of the breed. In Russia, where scarcity of food and 3 years of starvation must needs turn most people into grafters, theft is inevitable. The Bolsheviki are trying to suppress it with an iron hand. How can they be blamed? But try as I might, I could not silence my doubts. I groped for some moral support, for a dependable word, for someone to shed light on the disturbing questions. It occurred to me to write to Maxim Gorky. He might help. I called his attention to his own dismay and disappointment while visiting America. He had come believing in her democracy and liberalism, and found bigotry and lack of hospitality instead. I felt sure Gorky would understand the struggle going on within me, though the cause was not the same. Would he see me? 2 days later, I received a short note asking me to call. I had admired Gorky for many years. He was the living affirmation of my belief that the creative artist cannot be suppressed. Gorky, the child of the people, the pariah, had by his genius become one of the world's greatest, one who by his pen and deep human sympathy made the social outcast our kin. For years, I toured America interpreting Gorky's genius to the American people, elucidating the greatness, beauty, and humanity of the man and his works. Now I was to see him, and through him get a glimpse into the complex soul of Russia. I found the main entrance of his house nailed up, and there seemed to be no way of getting in. I almost gave up in despair when a woman pointed to a dingy staircase. I climbed to the very top and knocked on the first door I saw. It was thrown open, momentarily blinding me with a flood of light and steam from an overheated kitchen. Then I was ushered into a large dining room. It was dimly lit, chilly and cheerless in spite of a fire and a large collection of Dutch china on the walls. One of the 3 women I had noticed in the kitchen sat down at the table with me, pretending to read a book, but all the while watching me out of the corner of her eye. It was an awkward half-hour of waiting. Presently Gorky arrived. Tall, gaunt, and coughing, he looked ill and weary. He took me to his study, semi-dark and of depressing effect. No sooner had we seated ourselves than the door flew open, and another young woman, whom I had not observed before, brought him a glass of dark fluid, medicine, evidently. Then the telephone began to ring. A few minutes later, Gorky was called out of the room. I realized that I would not be able to talk with him. Returning, he must have noticed my disappointment. We agreed to postpone our talk till some less disturbed opportunity presented itself. He escorted me to the door, remarking, "You ought to visit the Baltic Fleet. The Kronstadt sailors are nearly all instinctive anarchists. You would find a field there." I smiled. "Instinctive anarchists?" I said. "That means they are unspoiled by preconceived notions, unsophisticated and receptive. Is that what you mean?" "Yes, that is what I mean," he replied. The interview with Gorky left me depressed, nor was our second meeting more satisfactory on the occasion of my first trip to Moscow. By the same train traveled Radek, Demyan Bedny, the popular Bolshevik versifier, and Ziperovich, then the president of the Petrograd unions. We found ourselves in the same car, the one reserved for Bolshevik officials and state dignitaries, comfortable and roomy. On the other hand, the common man, the non-communist without influence, had literally to fight his way into the always overcrowded railway carriages, provided he had a propusk to travel, a most difficult thing to procure. I spent the time of the journey discussing Russian conditions with Ziperovich, a kindly man of deep convictions, and with Demyan Bedny, a big, coarse-looking man. Radek held forth at length on his experiences in Germany and German prisons. I learned that Gorky was also on the train, and I was glad of another opportunity for a chat with him when he called to see me. The one thing uppermost in my mind at the moment was an article which had appeared in the Petrograd Pravda a few days before my departure. It treated of morally defective children, the writer urging prison for them. Nothing I had heard or seen during my 6 weeks in Russia so outraged me as this brutal and antiquated attitude toward the child. I was eager to know what Gorky thought of the matter. Of course, he was opposed to prisons for the morally defective. He would advocate reformatories instead. "What do you mean by morally defective?" I asked. "Our young are the result of alcoholism rampant during the Russian-Japanese War and of syphilis. What except moral defection could result from such a heritage?" he replied. I argued that morality changes with conditions and climate, and that unless one believed in the theory of free will, one cannot consider morality a fixed matter. As to children, their sense of responsibility is primitive, and they lack the spirit of social adherence. But Gorky insisted that there was a fearful spread of moral defection among children, and that such cases should be isolated. I then broached the problem that was troubling me most. What about persecution and terror? Were all the horrors inevitable, or was there some fault in Bolshevism itself? The Bolsheviki were making mistakes, but they were doing the best they knew how, Gorky said dryly. Nothing more could be expected, he thought. I recalled a certain article by Gorky, published in his paper, New Life, which I had read in the Missouri penitentiary. It was a scathing arraignment of the Bolsheviki. There must have been powerful reasons to change Gorky's point of view so completely. Perhaps he is right. I must wait. I must study the situation. I must get at the facts. Above all, I must see for myself Bolshevism at work. We spoke of the drama. On my first visit, by way of introduction, I had shown Gorky an announcement card of the dramatic course I had given in America. John Galsworthy was among the playwrights I had discussed then. Gorky expressed surprise that I considered Galsworthy an artist. In his opinion, Galsworthy could not be compared with Bernard Shaw. I had to differ. I did not underestimate Shaw, but considered Galsworthy the greater artist. I detected irritation in Gorky, and as his hacking cough continued, I broke off the discussion. He soon left. I remained dejected from the interview. It gave me nothing. When we pulled into the Moscow station, my chaperone, Demyan Bedny, had vanished, and I was left on the platform with all my traps. Radek came to my rescue. He called a porter, took me and my baggage to his waiting automobile, and insisted that I come to his apartments in the Kremlin. There I was graciously received by his wife and invited to dinner served by their maid. After that, Radek began the difficult task of getting me quartered in the Hotel National, known as the first house of the Moscow Soviet. With all his influence, it required hours to secure a room for me. Radek's luxurious apartment, the maidservant, the splendid dinner seemed strange in Russia, but the comradely concern of Radek and the hospitality of his wife were grateful to me. Except at the Zorins and the Shatovs, I had not met with anything like it. I felt that kindliness, sympathy, and solidarity were still alive in Russia.
This concludes today's reading of My Disillusionment in Russia, by Emma Goldman. Join us also the day after tomorrow for the subsequent part. Subscribe to Major Antonio's channel. Thank you for listening, and so long.